Good morning. What do y'all think about these lights? They look pretty good.
And I know a difference. The middle one was actually almond before that one.
Yep. Yep, they look really good now. I think that would be Brother JC, right? All right. We are in Esther chapter 2. Right. So Esther chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decided regarding her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and may the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and have them bring every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti." And the suggestion pleased the king, and he did accordingly. There was a Jew at the citadel in Susa whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been taken from Jerusalem with the exiles who had been deported with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had deported. He was the guardian of Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young woman was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and mother had died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about, when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and food, and gave her 7 choice female attendants from the king's palace, and transferred her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her to her people or her kindred, because Mordecai had instructed her that she was not to reveal them. And every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the courtyard of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. When the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus for the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beauty treatment were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with balsam oil and the cosmetics for women. The young woman would go into the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would enter, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go to the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther was finding favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and I think we are going to stop there. Well, we'll finish out. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal turban on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king held a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his officials and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces, and gave gifts in proportion to the king's bounties. Now when the virgins were gathered together for the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther still had not revealed to her relatives or her people, just as Mordecai had instructed her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, just as she had when under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, pretty sure I need to stop there, because I don't think I went past there. I think I stopped in 20. All right. So, last time, well, the time before last, we read about that 180 days of King Ahasuerus showing off all of his stuff to all these people, and then he had the 7-day feast. But then on the 7th day, he asked them to bring his queen, Vashti, at the time, to him and to unveil her in front of him. That was his request, in front of all of these people at this feast. But, of course, Vashti understood how degrading and demeaning that was, so she refused, although it put her in a pretty difficult predicament because obviously she's refusing the command of a king. But someone like Xerxes is, we've learned that he's irrational and he has this rage, so that was a big deal. So for the king to be refused by anyone, especially his wife, especially after all this time, he's showed off his kingdom, he has this great feast, all these people are there admiring all the things that he has, and then he makes a command of his wife, and she refused him. But had she have given in, she would have lost the respect of her people, her honor. And so she was in a bad position, and it said that Xerxes or Ahasuerus' wrath burned within him. And so he asked his advisors and his princes what he can do with Vashti, given history, because that's how the Persians did. They would look back in their laws and they would see what had been done in the past and see if they can implement the same law. But there wasn't a law in this situation. But one of his advisors, Mimikin, pointed out the fact that it would make them all look bad, not just Xerxes, if he didn't do something about it. And so he was saying that their wives would feel more comfortable disobeying them, for example, and it would spread throughout the kingdom, and it would be this big uproar of disobedience from the wives to the man in their time. So he was saying that she didn't just wrong you, she wronged us too. And so he suggested to the king to set her aside, to set her queenship aside, telling him to give that royal estate to someone else, someone better. And the king was pleased with this suggestion. We got into the first 4 verses of this chapter last time, and if you remember, there was this 3 to 4 year gap in between them, because it was his first year of reign, or his second year of reign, and then it was his 7th year in this chapter. But there was this war that happened with Greece. He led a campaign against Greece and he lost. And so not only did he set his queen aside, but he enters into this war and loses it. This is Ahasuerus. And so he's down and out. And we learned in those 4 verses that his anger had subsided and he remembered Vashti. He started regretting his decision. He was down because of the war, down because of that. And so he's in a bad place. And so his advisors are noticing this and realizing, oh crap, we're the ones that told him to set this woman aside. So what is he going to do to us whenever he comes to his senses and realizes what a bad mistake he made or whatever? Because if you remember, when he set that decree in motion, it can't be taken back because her name was entered with the decree. And so they suggested that he chooses a new successor. They suggested that he chooses from among virgins that were in Susa, that were very beautiful. And of course, Xerxes was also well known for his sensuality, so this pleased him. And so they began to look for all these women, and that brings us to verse 5 in chapter 2. It says, there was a Jew at the citadel in Susa whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been taken from Jerusalem with the exiles who had been deported with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had deported. He was the guardian to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father and mother. Now the young woman was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and mother had died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So now we're finally introduced to Esther and Mordecai. This is the first time in the book. Mordecai is Esther's cousin here, and apparently he was her guardian because her father and mother died. Hadassah was how Esther was known by the Jews, and Esther would have been her Persian name. The son of Kish here that it talks about ties Mordecai back to King Saul. If you would, let's turn to 1 Samuel 9, 1 and 2. 1 Samuel 9, 1 and 2. Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish. This is the same Kish that Esther's talking about. The son of Abiel, the son of Zeor, son of Bikorath, son of Aphiah, son of a Benjaminite, a valiant, mighty man. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a young and handsome man, and there was not a more handsome man than he among the sons of Israel. From his shoulders up, he was taller than any of the other people. So this is the same Kish that Esther's talking about. This isn't random. It hints at a bigger story of the Bible, but for now, Mordecai is just some random guy in the story. And so Esther, Hadassah, her Hebrew name means myrtle, which is just a common flower. It's not, or plant. It's nothing flashy. It's kind of a side lesson, whenever I was reading through this, God uses the least of us, and I think it's interesting here, God loves using ordinary, sinful even, and rebellious people, right? We see that throughout the entire Bible. And it's because He wants the glory. He wants to be able to use people that you wouldn't expect He would use to bring about His glory. We remember Paul and all the wickedness that he caused, yet he writes most of our New Testament today. Or David as the young shepherd boy, younger and smaller than all of his family. And Mary, a young girl from Nazareth, who we learn nothing good can come from Nazareth. But God loves using ordinary people, and that's the point. We don't need titles or a spotlight for God to use us in our lives. Mordecai's faithfulness in raising Esther, even in exile, even whenever all the prophets told them to go back, all the Jews, even in sin, God is setting the stage to enact His plan in Esther. It goes on in verse 8. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa, into the custody of Haggai, that is Esther, was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice female attendants from the king's palace, and transferred her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. So for the Persian Jews, this would have most likely been an honor to be taken in here as a secondary wife to the king, or possibly being a queen. The Hebrew word translated was broad. It doesn't contain any sort of violence, so this was probably an honor and not under compulsion. Esther's already finding favor here, we see, with Haggai, who's the person in charge of the harem, or the first harem, so much so that she was given the best place in this palace. And so we're already seeing God work in the story, because surely out of all of Susa, there were other women who were beautiful as well, who could have gained this favor, but we see God placing Esther on a pedestal in Haggai's eyes and giving her the best chance to please the king. It goes on in verse 10, Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred because Mordecai had instructed her that she was not to reveal them. And every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the courtyard of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So it was very unlikely for a Jewish exile to be queen. Mordecai was protecting her by keeping her quiet about who she was. But it said that he would still check on her every day. He still loved her, of course, and wanted to make sure she was doing okay, even though he couldn't be with her in the harem. Verse 12. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after the end of her 12 months, under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beauty treatment were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with balsam oil and the cosmetics for women. This process isn't unusual for Persian royalty. Myrrh was a costly oil for like skincare and fragrance. And if you remember, it was a gift from the Magi to Jesus whenever he was born. All these treatments, they're signaling wealth and status, which makes sense given, who who Xerxes is. The preparation that they had to go through just to get an audience with the king was a 12-month preparation. They would have beauty treatments, training. It wasn't just some romantic story. This was an audition under pressure. Persian kings like Xerxes, they had massive harems. Think about all the women that were possibly there competing against each other, for lack of a better term. All competing for his favor. On the surface, it just seems kind of like a beauty regimen, but we see God is at work. This year wait, it's not an accident. God is preparing Esther, and it takes time to put her in place. He's making her noticed and admired and recognized by all these people so that she will gain favor with the king later when she's finally revealed to him. We think of David's year as a shepherd boy before he became king to prepare him, or even Jesus, who waits 30 years before his ministry really began, God's timing is also at play here as well. Once again, we can see him in the background, using this preparation time to mold Esther into who she needs to be to gain favor. And then verse 13, the young woman would go in to take the king in this way, to the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would enter, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So after all these preparations are made over the year, the women were able to ask for anything like clothing, jewelry, and perfume, anything that they felt would beautify them for this. And whatever they wanted was given to them. And then they would spend the night with the king, and after they were taken to the second house for the secondary wives or the concubines. There were 3 total houses in these harems, or in his harem. A harem for the virgins, where the preparations are made that we know about. The second house, where the women would go once they complete this grooming process and have their night with the king and become his official wife or concubine. And then there's the third house that housed the queen. And even though they would become a concubine to the king, the women in the second house, they couldn't come back into the presence of the king unless he called upon them. And so they're basically kind of an inmate of the second house. I'm sure they didn't look at it quite like that because they were taken care of and all that stuff. But once they spent this night with the king, they were part of his household permanently, though, even if they aren't chosen as queen, unless, of course, they're set aside like Vashti was. But these women were subject to the king's whims and wishes. Whenever he felt like it, he would summon them. They're not really allowed to go into his presence unless called upon, which is a good point for later on in the story, because we'll see Esther go into his presence and risk her life for her people. It goes on in verse 15. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther was finding favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal turban on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. So, as verse 13 pointed out, the women, they're able to ask for anything that they want, right? And we see here that Esther only requested what Haggai, the person in charge of that part of the harem, recommended. This is wisdom, whether on God's part or her part, or both. We don't know whether Esther was happy or upset about her situation. She might have been happy about it. It's possible. She was taken, so I kind of like to picture it as she's at least a little bit mad about it or upset with it. And I believe that the wisdom is from God entirely, really. I like to picture Esther kind of begrudgingly following through with all of the orders, just kind of going along to get along while she's being groomed. And so instead of just trying to impress the king, she's just, yeah, just give me whatever you got. Let's do this, you know. But it works out in her favor because she had the input of Haggai, who's in charge of the harem. He's probably done this before, or at least knows the process. And so even though Esther was possibly unwilling, God intervenes and works in the background. But of course, I could be wrong. Esther may have been, you know, listening to Haggai because she was happy about her situation and she wanted to make the best of it. But that doesn't diminish God's intervention in the story. Haggai didn't have to show her favoritism. Out of all the other women, I imagine there were others that were beautiful, possibly more beautiful, and Haggai could have chosen them to favor, but instead he chooses Esther, a Jew, because God had a plan, and his plans always come to light. And another point is her humility here, right? She could have adorned herself with all the things that she thought was beautiful and good, and had all the great perfume and all that kind of stuff to try to impress the king, and she didn't. Instead, she trusted what was provided and suggested instead of relying on her own strength and understanding. It's the symbolism of how God is or should be in our lives for us, right? Not relying on ourselves, but trusting in His will and strength. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, if you would turn there with me. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Esther didn't lean on her own ideas of beauty or strategy or whatever. She submits to God, and she just proceeds with the process and goes with what Haggai tells her to. Ultimately, God's will is done, whether we're participants in it or not. We talked about this last time too in Romans, where we learned that, you know, you can either be a part of His will willingly, or you can be a part of His will unwillingly. But either way, providence takes over, God's providence, and He prevails. So either way you look at this situation, whether she was willing or not, God raises her up, and He uses Haggai to do it. And she was finding favor in everyone's sight. This happened in the month Tebeth or Tevet, I guess is how you pronounce those, depending on your translation. This isn't actually theologically significant from what I can find. This is the first mention of the name in the Bible. It would have been December or January in our calendar. But it does mark a pivotal moment of her eventual rise to queen. Jews celebrate it today at the beginning of the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, but it's unrelated to Esther. But one thing that does stand out to me is that this was the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign. The number 7 in the Bible is significant. I'm sure we all know that. One of the meanings of the number is completeness of timing. And so in Esther, it could be suggesting this divine ordained moment in her life, a turning point, to allow Him to, in the future, to save His people. 7 is also the Sabbath day of rest and peace, hinting at a freedom from the plot that we're going to get into later in Esther to kill the Jews. And 7 is the complete number overall as well, possibly giving us a glimpse into her ultimate role as deliverer when everything is accomplished. Verse 17 is also significant. It says, "The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal turban on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti." From the context, it doesn't really seem like the king kept searching, right? He kind of love at first sight kind of thing. As soon as he had his night with Esther, he was sold, is what it reads like, and loved her more than all the other people, all the other women. It doesn't say it, but as many women as were there, surely she wasn't the last one to come, I would think, or maybe she was, but it kind of seems like she was immediately chosen as queen, though. Either way, he didn't waste time making her queen, and we can think of this in the light of Jesus too, right? The king sets a royal crown on Esther to make her queen. Esther replaces Vashti, stepping into a role that she wasn't seeking, but she was destined for. Her queenship can foreshadow the church, where we're crowned by Jesus' righteousness. Revelation 19:7 says, "The marriage supper of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready." Esther's preparation and favor are one and the same with Christians. We are the bride of Christ, and our job is to prepare ourselves as well. And it points to redemption. As Esther becomes queen to save her people, Jesus crowns us to share in his salvation. We aren't just spectators in God's story of redemption. We're crowned and redeemed for a purpose. He goes on in verse 18, "Then the king held a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all of his officials and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts in proportion to the king's bounty." So here we go again with another feast. We're the second chapter in, and we've had 3 now. But this time it's for Esther. Ahasuerus, he throws this huge feast to her honor, even naming it after her, even making a holiday after it for all the people. This isn't just royal pomp like the other feasts, though, for him to show off. This is a public showing of her place in his kingdom now as queen. And this holiday, it was a kingdom-wide day of rest, as our holidays are. It's the same kind of thing. And he didn't even stop at the holiday. He also gave gifts across all the provinces. This banquet, the holiday, the gifts, are all symbolism of the church and our redemption. So next time we're going to start diving into the plot that you probably all know that Mordecai discovers, which ultimately leads to the plot of Haman against the Jews. But just like Esther, we are redeemed for a purpose. God wants to use us in his kingdom. But we have to be like Esther too. We have to be willing to be used and not try to adorn ourselves with the jewelry and the perfume of this life to make ourselves better, but trust in his ultimate plan for our lives and his will, and be an open vessel for him. So that's all I've got this morning. I'll ask Brother Johnny and Skip to come up and lead us in a song of invitation. If you need prayer, I'd be happy to pray with you if you come to this side. If you want to be left alone, I'll leave you alone if you come to this one.
Have thine own way.